Great. Okay, so welcome to Talking Data Equity. My name is Heather Krause, and I'm the founder of an organization called We All Count. I'm also a mathematical statistician, and I'm coming to you today from my hometown, which is Toronto, Canada. And one of the things that we do at We All Count is that we build tools and we do training that allows anyone who is working with data to align the work that they're doing with quantitative data, with their equity goals, with the values and lived experiences that they're trying to make meaning for, that they're trying to center in the way that we're doing data equity work. And one of the things that we have found is really helpful is to make sure that we carve out time in our schedules to talk about some of the practicalities of equity and quantitative work. And one of the ways we do that is most Fridays, we do something called Talking Data Equity. And that's what we're doing right now. So most Fridays from noon to about 12:55 Toronto time, East Coast time, we come together on this Zoom link. The Zoom link stays the same from week to week. And we talk about practical issues in data equity. And lots of times we have special guests. And sometimes instead of special guests, we have special topics. And that's what we're going to do today. It's just me kind of talking at the beginning today. And our special topic is statistical significance and equity. And we highly encourage you to participate. This isn't supposed to be like a sit and receive. I'm not going to spend an hour lecturing you on statistical significance. I'm going to share a couple of slides now at the beginning, just to kind of give us some common language, talk a little bit about statistical significance and equity and some of my experiences working with it, but I'm only going to do that for a few minutes. And then we're going to just open it up, and you can ask questions, make comments, have conversations with me or have conversations with each other. Really is supposed to be an informal time for practitioners to connect and get some useful information. And now, there are a lot of people that come to these Talking Data Equity times, and we really would like to keep running them as Zoom meetings, because when they're Zoom meetings, you all can see each other. And the only way this is going to work is if we have a few kind of logistical guidelines. And so we ask that you don't unmute yourself unless you raise your hand first and we call on you. So if you want to ask a question in the chat, feel free to do that. And if you're going to use the chat, you have two options. You can type your question into the chat and with the drop-down menu set to everybody, and then everybody here in the meeting and everybody who's watching the recording will see your question, and your question will be kind of associated with your name. If you would prefer to ask your question privately, you can do that in the chat using the drop-down menu. Just ask the question directly to me. And we usually get a lot of questions that way, which is great. I do my best to answer as many as we can. And I will ask the question, but I will not associate your name with that question. So that way you can participate totally anonymously. And then, of course, the third way, after I go through these couple of slides, the third way to ask questions is to just raise your hand using the Zoom function. There's a little smiley face with a plus on the smiley face's head. If you click on that, you'll see an option to raise your hand. So after I'm done my couple of slides, if you want to come off mute, just raise your hand, and the tech team will take people off mute, hopefully as close to the order in which you raise your hands as possible. But we don't always get that perfect. All right, so that's kind of what Talking Data Equity is, and I'm looking forward to today because today is a topic that we get a ton of questions about, and I'll be really frank. Today's topic, statistical significance and everything that goes with that, is a very controversial topic. There's lots of people who have strong opinions and strong disagreements, and like everything in the world, especially the world of statistics, there isn't like a single unassailable truth. So I'm going to just do my best to share my understanding and my experiences. And I would just invite you to do the same. One thing I definitely want to say is that this is a place, a space, Talking Data Equity is a space where we value curiosity, and we expect you all to treat each other and me with respect and generosity and kindness. I know this can be a heated topic, but we just ask that we all keep in mind what we are actually talking about here. Okay, so statistical significance and equity. What the heck is that? What even is statistical significance? So one of the things I'm going to try and do here in these slides is walk a line between talking about enough information that we can get into the meat of statistical significance and equity without having it turn into a statistical theory lesson. I know there's a lot of people here, and there's a real diversity in backgrounds, in interests, in how accustomed people are to talking in different mathematical ways or thinking in different mathematical ways or applied ways. So we're going to try and spend a couple of minutes kind of level setting. So statistical significance. What the heck is it even? Bottom line is, most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time when we're talking about statistical significance, we're usually talking about some measure that is associated with a p-value. Now, that of course raises the obvious next question, what is a p-value? And what is a p-value is a topic of a great deal of confusion and frustration and anger, and also humor, because you can ask a lot of people what a p-value is and you'll get a lot of different answers. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about p-values, but mostly I want to really keep the focus on what this has to do with equity. And that's more about how we use p-values, how we think about p-values, and what we interpret p-values to mean. Lots of times, people think that a p-value is the probability that our results are caused by chance. The bad news is that almost all of the time, of course, nothing is true all of the time, but almost all of the time, that is not a correct interpretation of a p-value. A p-value is not actually the probability that your results are caused by chance. A p-value is actually the probability of the data that you're analyzing being at least as extreme as it is, given that the null hypothesis is true. That is snore, right? Like, that is hardly ever a question that somebody has in real life. Lots of times people have a question in real life, which is, are my results real or are they caused by chance? That's a question lots of us have. So we wish that a p-value was answering that question. Unfortunately, the p-value answers a question that very few of us have. And that question is, given that my null hypothesis is true, how likely it is that the data I have is what it is or more extreme than it is? That is not a question that keeps us up at night. So this is a fundamental issue with p-values. So given that the null hypothesis is true, what the heck is a null hypothesis? Another excellent question. Sometimes people think that the null hypothesis is the hypothesis or the guess that there is no mean difference. So if we're trying to say, is there a difference between two groups of people and their outcome, the null hypothesis is that we hypothesize or we guess that there is no mean difference. That is what is commonly considered to be a null hypothesis. That is not actually a null hypothesis. That is a nil hypothesis. Again, you can see why we have problems with statistical significance. So that's a nil hypothesis. The guess, the idea that there's no difference, is a nil hypothesis, not a null hypothesis. A null hypothesis is just an alternative hypothesis. A null hypothesis is the alternative hypothesis to the one that you are trying to test. It is possible that a nil hypothesis, in other words, that there is no mean difference between the two things we're measuring, can be your null hypothesis. So it is very possible that your particular null hypothesis is that there's no actual difference here between these two things, but that is not a requirement. That is not by definition true. And that's going to be important in just a second. This isn't just semantics. This is actually going to be important in just a second. So again, what a p-value is actually measuring is the probability of the data being at least as extreme as it is, given that the null hypothesis, which we just talked about, is true. So what does this mean? This means that, back to statistical significance, a result is considered statistically significant by the standards of each individual study when the p-value is at or below the threshold set by the study. This is, again, really important because lots of people think, well, if your p-value is less than 0.05, your results are statistically significant. That is not a rule. That is not a scientific fact. The 0.05 level of a p-value is convention. It's a habit. And that habit is very appropriate in some situations and very inappropriate in other situations. And we're going to look at some of the situations where it might be a good idea or it might be a bad idea. Okay, so we're kind of putting together the building blocks of what we're talking about. So what we're talking about is, I'm going to actually stay on the slide for a second. What we're talking about is we have to get a null hypothesis, which is the alternative hypothesis to the one we're trying to test. Sometimes that null hypothesis is there's no difference or the difference is zero. It doesn't have to be that. It can be whatever is appropriate for your situation. Then you decide what level of probability you want to consider meaningful. Lots of people choose 95%, which means the p-value is 0.05, but that is not a rule. That is a habit. That is a convention. And then you calculate your p-value, and your p-value tells you whether or not, given that your alternative hypothesis or your null hypothesis is true, how likely it is that the data you have exists at its current state or a more extreme state. We are going to look at what this means in practice in just a second. But if you really do want your p-value to tell you whether or not your results are caused by chance, which is what the question a lot of people are actually trying to get, then you need to set your null hypothesis to chance. And as soon as you realize that that's what you have to do in order for your p-value to mean our results are not caused by chance, it becomes really clear why it's so hard to do this. Because figuring out a null hypothesis that is equivalent in the context of your project to chance is very, very, very hard. And it's almost never the difference is zero, because for the difference to be zero would often not happen by chance. That would often require a very specific process to be occurring in the world in which you are trying to measure. So although it seems like semantics, it seems like just an academic pastime to be sure to differentiate the difference between a p-value saying your results are caused by chance and your results are this probability given that the null hypothesis is true, is not just a matter of semantics. It's not just an academic theory. It's actually a really important practical distinction. And it becomes incredibly important once we start trying to apply an equity lens. So let's look at a practical example, because I know this is a lot of words. One of the places that this has huge equity implications, huge practical implications, is when we're conducting a pay equity analysis. So long story short, pay equity analysis are very complicated, but long story short, we're looking for differences in pay that are not explained by the compensation philosophy of the organization and are associated with things like race and gender. So if we're doing a pay equity analysis, we might find that the pay gap in this company between men and white women is $900, and the pay gap between men and Black women is $1,200. This is a real data set. And this $900 gap has a p-value of 0.02. And this $1,200 gap has a p-value of 0.19. So what the heck does that mean? Does that mean that this gap is real and this gap is not real? Does it mean that this gap is caused by intention and this gap is caused by chance? Very, very unlikely that that is the case in either of those things. So what's actually going on? One of the things that we really like to focus on at We All Count is paying attention to the choices that you're making, noticing the choices, and making sure that when you're making the choices, you're doing so in a way that supports your equity goals. So first question you need to ask when you're looking at these p-values. These p-values are associated with the differences between two things, pay of two different groups of people. What are these p-values testing? Well, most of the time, people have a habit of, for their null hypothesis, using the nil hypothesis, using the idea that there is no pay difference or that the pay difference is 0. So this p-value, first thing it's testing to realize, important to realize, is that you are not testing whether the differences that you're looking at, those $900 and $1,200, are caused by chance. You are testing how likely those gaps are to exist, given that your null hypothesis, that there is no pay difference, is false. And it's very easy to see once we start breaking it down this way, that if you have a company where there is no difference between the people in your organization, that is not synonymous with chance. That is not a proxy for chance. If you have a company where everyone is getting paid the same, something very intentional has happened to produce that situation. So that's the question that the p-value is answering. And that is not a good definition of chance. And that's okay. It doesn't have to be a definition of chance. You just have to know, what are these p-values testing? Second thing that you need to ask is, are these two groups the same size? And the reason that matters is because the calculation of a p-value is very, very sensitive to size differences between the two groups. And that's what's going on in a big way here in this organization. This organization has many fewer Black women on staff than it has white women. And so because of that, white women, because their group is larger, gets a small p-value, a statistically significant p-value with a much smaller gap than the smaller group. So it's always really important to remember that if you are using a p-value to decide whether a difference is real or meaningful, when you do that, you are always putting the onus of proof on the smallest group. And when we're trying to do equity work, that is usually the reverse of what we're doing. So what we're doing when we set up this test here is we're saying, we're going to assume that there's no pay difference between men and women. And in order to prove that there is a non-random difference, we're going to put a burden of proof that is 2 to 3 times higher on the smallest groups of people. And that's not usually what you want to do when you're setting up an equity analysis, whether it's pay equity analysis, whether it's an analysis of, are you closing gaps in educational outcomes? Are you changing the way that your investing strategy works? That's not usually the question that you're trying to ask. So I'm not saying that this is unscientific and that you shouldn't do it. But when you do it, you really need to be aware of the assumptions that you're making and the choices that you're making, and ask yourself, is that a good alignment with what I'm trying to do? Third is what I was talking about before. What is an appropriate cutoff? Let's say you're going to set it all up this way. There's no written in stone that this p-value is significant and this is not. Somebody makes a choice to decide whether we're going to use this cutoff of 0.05 or whether we're going to use something else. And again, when we're working with humans and data about humans, the percentage of certainty that you need is going to depend on the question that you're trying to answer. If you're in a court of law, you probably need a different level of certainty than when you're trying to help an organization adjust its compensation structure to stop paying Black women so much less. Like, you probably need a different level of certainty for that. And again, where are we putting the burden of proof? Where are we putting the onus to change? Lots of times our habits put the onus to change on the smallest and most marginalized group of people when we use p-values without thinking through what we're doing. Last question is, make sure that you are clear on the question that you are actually trying to answer. Are you actually trying to answer the question? Is the pay difference between men and women 0? Or are you trying to answer a different kind of question? Because lots of times you're probably trying to answer a different kind of question, and a p-value might be much more useful in that setting. All right, so all this technical stuff, all of this semantics, I know, yuck, it's Friday. But this is a very important topic, and it's worth kind of wading through the math a bit, because this really, really matters for equity. If we just crank out this ritual of calculating a p-value with substituting the nil hypothesis for null hypothesis and just cranking it out and not thinking about group sizes, not thinking about questions, not paying attention to what cutoffs are appropriate, very bad things happen. Sally Clark was a mother in England who got convicted of murdering her 2 infant sons due to a fundamental misunderstanding about how p-values worked. They used it in reverse. They used it the way that a lot of people use it to, given the data, what's the probability of this result? That is the reverse. And even after she was sent to jail, she never recovered. The Royal Academy of Statistics in the UK had to step in and sort all this out. Say, this was a miscarriage of justice, but by then her life was quite frankly destroyed. In New England, there was research on whether supplying laptops to Black commuting students improved outcomes. They discontinued this program due to a misunderstanding of p-values. It was reanalyzed. The laptops were working. Misunderstanding of p-values. Post-secondary institutions are making strategic investments, trying to bring more equitable rates. They're choosing to invest elsewhere due to misunderstandings of p-values. There's an experimental new healthcare management policy under research right now, and the first round was deemed a failure due to a fundamental misunderstanding of p-values. So this isn't just a semantics language thing. P-values really need attention to the choices. We need to pay attention to the choices about what the alternative hypothesis actually should be, what that null hypothesis should be, how big of a difference really matters in your context, how meaningful is it if we get it wrong? That's like what level of certainty do you actually need? And then attached to all of these choices is who is getting privileged or prioritized by these choices. And how can we make sure that we're prioritizing the humans that we want to prioritize in our research by making intentional choices using p-values? Okay, I'm going to stop talking, but the last thing I want to say is, does this mean I think we should stop using p-values? No, it does not. Please do not go away from this and say, Heather says we should never use p-values. I am not saying that. P-values are a useful tool. However, they're only a useful tool if we pay attention to how we're using it, to what questions we're trying to answer, and to how we're interpreting it. Because these choices have human implications, they have mathematical implications. And a p-value is a very valuable tool that can be used along with a whole bunch of other tools if used carefully and correctly. So we have, yeah. So it is possible to do very rigorous, very reliable, very robust science and statistical research that is still aligned with our equity goals. I'm in no way saying we need to dumb down our science. We need to soften up our rigor. We need to, forget about excellent science so that we can do something inclusive. What I'm actually saying is the opposite. I'm saying if we want to do equitable science, we need to get much, much better at doing that science and paying more attention rather than just cranking through habits. Okay, so those are my slides to try and get everybody on a common. I'm going to stop sharing my screen if I can. Yep, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to open it up to you folks. So again, we expect you all to treat me and each other with respect and kindness and curiosity. And how the heck? Okay, so there are some questions that are very good questions. Here we go. There's some great questions in the chat. Some of them are public, some of them are private, and I will start going through those questions in the chat. But before I do the chat questions, I always like to give anybody who's here in person an opportunity to raise their hands and unmute themselves if you want to ask your question live. I'm going to give you like 10 seconds to ask a question live, and then we'll start going to the chat. Excellent. Go ahead, Anne.
So one of the things that we teach is use of effect sizes rather than statistical significance. And I didn't know if you were going to comment on that or if you were going to do another whole session on the value of effect sizes.
Yeah, so great question. I wasn't planning to like do any slides about that today, but not because it's not important or doesn't matter. And actually it's a really probably will answer a lot of the questions that are coming into the chat. So an effect size is the term that a lot of technical people use for what that difference actually is. So in other words, in that pay equity example, when there's a $1,200 difference between the pay being given to Black men and the pay being, or no, not Black men in that company and Black women in that company, that $1,200 difference is an effect size. And exactly how you use the term effect size depends on your discipline and your country and your training and things like that. But basically it's the size of the difference. And that is a really, really good way of thinking about it. Like, lots of times, if I just use that pay equity example, when I'm working with a company and they say, well, but we really need that p-value because that p-value tells us what's real or what's meaningful. And I say, I understand that. I have a lot of empathy for your wanting a guideline for what's real or what's meaningful. And unfortunately, the p-value probably can't answer that question for you in this situation. And so it's up to your company to decide what the effect size is that is going to result in your company committing to action. And so you can see why a company doesn't want to answer that question, because no company wants to, or not no company, actually, there are some companies, but few companies want to go on record saying, we are comfortable with $1,000 gap, and anybody who has a gap that's bigger than that, we're going to adjust, because that requires a lot more transparency and ownership. It's much easier to kind of hide incorrectly behind this, you know, myth of the p-value. And so effect sizes are a great source. And when they say something like, well, we don't know whether that difference is real, again, that's often a funny thing if we sit down and think about what that means. You know, we have everybody's salary. We have data on everybody's salary. We know what they're getting paid. Like, this is a mythological list of compensation. So we do actually know what the gaps are. Okay, yes, love this person. Okay, I'm gonna go to this question because I think this is another fundamental question that'll answer a lot of the other questions, which is, this discussion up until now has been within the framework of frequentist statistics. There was also a Bayesian statistical framework. Bayesians argue that their framework is better suited for equity analysis. What's your take on this? This is a much deeper issue. Okay, so again, let's define the terms just briefly. Again, we could talk for days about this, but that is correct. P-values and the things like the null hypothesis is associated with like one school of doing statistics. It's been around for a long time. Lots and lots of people are kind of trained in this way of doing statistics. there's another school of statistics called Bayesian statistics. And their approach to probability and likelihood is different. And there's lots of people who are now putting together the Bayesian and frequentist approaches. And so one of the things that's usually different in Bayesian work is that they don't do hypothesis testing. So they don't set up like this null hypothesis and this p-value because of all the issues that I'm talking about. Is that better for equity? I would say there's nothing inherently better for equity about Bayesian analysis. I am trained to do Bayesian analysis, so I really do like Bayesian analysis. I would say I prefer doing Bayesian analysis. I wouldn't say, though, that Bayesian analysis is fundamentally better for equity. Bayesian analysis also has the same problems about small sample sizes, when not small sample sizes, but differences in group sizes. It's still very sensitive because I tried it with some of our pay equity work. It's still very sensitive. So I would say both frequentist and Bayesian statistics have strengths and are useful. And both, if used with care and attention, can be aligned with your equity goals. And neither one can just be cranked out and hope for ethics or equity. You will not get that. But yes, there are a lot of strengths to Bayesian analysis, and there's a lot of ways that you can incorporate contextual information with Bayesian analysis. I'm a big fan of Bayesian analysis. We should actually do a whole talking data equity on Bayesian analysis. Yes, and when done properly, both schools of statistics give generally similar results. That's true in my experience as well. And I do a lot of compare and contrast. That's what I do a lot in my theoretical work, is same analysis in two ways. Okay, so somebody is asking, can you, okay, there's a lot of questions. Oh yeah, I gotta check somebody has their hand raised. Don't forget to raise your hand if you want to ask something. There's a lot of questions. I'm going to see if I can summarize some chunks of questions into, so we'll get to as many as possible popular questions. Okay, one of the questions, I want to answer some of the really practical questions in relation to equity. And so can you further explain how to set a cutoff value? So what I think this person means by cutoff value is that 0.05. So a p-value of 0.05 is nothing but a habit. It's nothing but a convention. And that convention, if you dig deep into it, does not have a great ethical background. It's not a fantastic story. So how to figure out what p-value might be a cutoff for you depends on how important that balance between certainty and what the relative pros and cons are of accidentally thinking that you've found an important effect when you didn't, or accidentally thinking that there is no effect when there is. And so it's your job as the research team to figure out which is worse and which is worse for who, because that's the important equity question. Like if we accidentally give someone resources when they don't need them, that's one type of error that we might make by accepting a p-value. Or if we accidentally withhold resources from someone that might need them, that's a different type of error that we might make with a p-value. And so it's your job to kind of figure out which of those types of making a mistake is better or worse for your particular project. That's why the idea of that there's one p-value that should be applied across science is just on its face ridiculous. So that's the question that you want to think about. How certain do we need to be? What happens if we make a mistake? What happens if we decide that nobody who's a Black woman in our company gets a raise? because we're going to just chalk that difference up to noise rather than a real difference. And how certain do we need to be? So if we're a company that really just wants to make absolutely sure that we're taking into account all of the pay gaps that we possibly could, we probably want that p-value to be much lower, like maybe like 0.2 instead of 0.05. But if you're doing, very precise medical research and you want to make sure that nobody dies because of a mistake about like a side effect of a pill, then you're going to want that higher level of certainty. So it really matters. Right. Oh, great. People are sharing. Thank you so much for sharing this. There's a paper being shared in the chat about the perceptions of statistical significance. I am looking forward to reading that. So I should say, I didn't say, but this recording, as well as all of the resources that we can find that come up today in the chat, will be shared on our Talking Data Equity community forum, and the link is right there. So you'll be able to watch this video later. I know some of you had to leave or are late coming. You can watch the whole video at your leisure. And we'll also put links to all the resources there. And you don't have to sign up or anything. You can watch the video no matter what. If you want to ask a question or share another resource on that forum, you do have to sign up. It doesn't cost you anything. It's not a membership site or anything like that. You just have to give yourself a password. Okay, great. Now, anybody that is in the room that wants to raise their hand, go right ahead. But, okay. Is the method of statistical analysis different if we are only describing differences when we have all the data for an entire population versus using it in a predictive manner? This is not a basic question. I mean, it is a basic question, but it's a basic question in using the term basic as in fundamental to how we use statistics. So this is a fabulous question, and this is why we're having Talking Data Equity. No question too small, no question too big, and this is a very important question. And of course, there's a difference between what should happen and what does happen. And that's really, really important when we talk about good science. What should happen in science and what does happen in science is where we run into equity problems. And so there are three broad types of statistical analysis: descriptive, predictive, and causal. Of course, there's lots of overlaps and things like that, but and the way that we do descriptive analysis is different than the way that we do predictive analysis. However, the calculation of a p-value most of the time is the same. So if you have like just a descriptive analysis, like let's say you're collecting data on the people that attend a program that you're running, and your funder, for whatever reason, wants you to give them a p-value on the statistical significance of the difference. Like in your after-school camp, did you get more girls than boys? Let's just say you can calculate a p-value for that. And you would calculate it in the very same way as you would calculate a p-value, for example, if you were doing a causal analysis, like if there was, you were trying to A/B test a new marketing initiative, and you wanted to know, did your marketing initiative work better for girls or better for boys? And I know gender's not binary. I'm just using that as a very quick toy example. The way that you would calculate those p-values, even though one's descriptive and one is causal, would essentially in practice be the same. So most of the time, if you're looking at a p-value, will have been calculated using something like this. Excellent. All right, go ahead. If somebody has their hand raised, M. Matz, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I was reading in the chat and listening, and first, before I say what I was going to say, thank you for this today around the p-values. I feel like I'm not going crazy, like when I try and talk about this to folks. someone in the chat, and I hear this often, mentioning using the ACS, the census data. And so one of the other challenges I think that we don't talk about with p-value or with size of population is the type of data that we're using. So the ACS is about characteristics of the population, not the size. So if we're using that data, it also doesn't weight the survey returns. And what happens is, and there's a website, and I'll try and find it so I can put it in the chat, that you can go to and see who completed the survey in that community, what percentage and what the demographics of them were. Someone made a tool, and sometimes it's as little as 20%. And typically it tends to be more Caucasian and higher income. There are lots of reasons why others might not fill it in. And then they predict or they extrapolate from those numbers and make assumptions about a population whole. So I just wanted to throw in there that not only are you talking about the p-value, which has its own set of issues, depending on the data that's used, and in some places census data is the standard, it's very messy data and it's not actually appropriate for equity work. So I just thank you for this today. I'm gonna have to go back and rewatch because there were so many things I couldn't keep up with, but just wanted to throw that nugget in there. Thank you.
Very, very valuable nugget. I'm so happy that you did throw that nugget in there. And what you're saying is very true. Like, we're talking only as ever, when we're talking about data equity, it's a huge intersectional, nuanced, holistic system of choices. When we are generating evidence, there are hundreds of choices that we're making, and every one of those choices matters for equity. And so we're most days talking about one little tiny choice in a whole ecosystem of choices, and what data you're going to apply a p-value calculation to is a critical choice. I'm going to answer a question from the chat, and then I'm going to get to the next person with their hand raised, because there's a really, really important question in the chat, which is, when thinking about p-values, I thought that the question they answered was, what is the probability that these data come from a population in which there are no systematic differences between groups? Is this the same or different than what you're saying? Thank you for asking that question. Mostly that is different than what I'm saying. So the p-value answers the question, if your assumption is correct. No, I got it wrong. See, p-values are such a nightmare. If your assumption is incorrect, if your assumption is incorrect, how likely is it that you're looking at the data that you're looking at, or some data that's more extreme? That's the question that p-value is answering. So you can set up a situation where the p-value is answering the question in comparing two groups in our population, there is no difference. That can be your null hypothesis. And then the p-value is going to give you the probability that that's incorrect given the data you're looking at. And I know that that is really hard to wrap your head around. It's really hard for me to wrap my head around. And it is a complicated thing. And so the important thing is there's never content. So the p-value is never saying always across all research that the population isn't different, or that the results aren't being caused by chance. The p-value never answers a question that has content in it, because the content of what the question that the p-value is answering comes from how you frame your null hypothesis. Okay, all right. So someone with the first name that reads like Zohar, I don't know how to pronounce it. I apologize if you could help me with that. Has their hand raised. Oh, great. Hi.
Hi. Thank you for this. This is so fascinating. I think one thing we can agree on is that whatever p-value is about, it's about inferring from a sample to a population, I think. And then my question is, what's the role of sampling here, and specifically probability sample? How important is probability sample? And given that in much of program evaluation, we use surveys that are not probability based, what is the role of
Yes.
p-values there? That's the question.
Fabulous question. I'm so glad you're here with us today, Zohar. So first of all, p-values can definitely be used to answer questions about populations based on data that's from a small group of that population, which is usually called a sample. But p-values can also be used to answer questions about complete data sets. So you don't have to have a sample to use a p-value, but you can have a sample. So it's not exclusionary of that, but it's also not by definition only for samples. And your question is a great one. So when we're trying to use a little bit of data, like let's say we want to understand a whole community of people, and we want to know whether or not this group of people wants a park with our budget surplus or they want a swimming pool. And we can't ask every single person in our community. So we ask a small subgroup of people in our community. That's called a sample. And how we gather that sample is really important. What you're talking about is a probability sample. And that's a very specific way of collecting data so that you try and get a sample of people from your community that are going to be a really good representation of that whole community. And we should also do a talking data equity on sampling and the pros and cons of all the different ways of doing it. But absolutely, the way that your data was collected and how representative your data is of the people that you're trying to understand, is there a meaningful difference? Is there meaningful differences between different types of people who voted for the park or voted for the swimming pool? The makeup of your sample, and whether you went to the existing swimming pool and asked everybody who was there whether they wanted a park or a swimming pool, or whether you carefully selected different types of people, it's going to make a big difference in how meaningful that p-value is. And that relates to a question that's been coming up a lot in the chat, which is what if we weight our data? If we have small groups, if we weight our data, does that help out with the problem in the p-value? That is a fabulous question, and I'm so happy you asked it. And the sad answer, as it is almost always with p-values, is no. Weighting data can give you better estimates, and there are lots of different ways to weight the data that can give you estimates, but it's not really going to add more information that's going to allow you to have a p-value that is going to answer your question more accurately for a small group. It's not really going to achieve that for you. But there are lots of good reasons to weight your data, fabulous reasons to weight data, but it's not really going to change the meaning or the small group problem of your p-value. Okay, somebody named Sarah, I think that's how you pronounce it. I'm not sure. You'll have to help me. Are you able to unmute?
Can you hear me?
I can now, yes.
Oh, great. Chose the right audio output. Thank you. Yeah, so this weighting piece has been on my mind since I took the advanced training months ago. And I was really hoping that we could talk a little bit today about sample sizes and where there's a couple stumbling blocks we're running into with the project. One is that we have measures of, let's just start with racial identity groups. That's a check all that apply. So the first question is, do you have any updated sources, or does anyone in the room have updated sources on how to deal with, I guess, sources for understanding population size estimates for racial groups that have a different way of approaching the major categories that are more inclusive of different breakdowns of multiracial categories, for example. We have a check all that apply question, and we did that with an eye towards wanting to be more inclusive of how people identify themselves, and also to see how our data will fall with different categories. And that is our big stumbling block, is not being able to find, well, not really having a clear direction or set of directions we could go. So that's, I guess let's just start with one question. We'll start with that.
Yeah. That is a really important question. Again, I'm extremely happy that you asked it. And I'm probably not going to get into a satisfactory answer, but I can tell you that there are a lot of pros and cons to how you collect categorical, characteristic, social identity, or demographic data. And it's not always very intuitive because sometimes the things that we try and do for equity end up making the groups that we know are marginalized or being oppressed, or that we're really trying to make meaning for, end up in a really, really small group. And then we have this problem here of the p-value, so that we want to understand if an initiative is making a meaningful change for a group of people. And we want to, we're working in an environment where somebody, a publisher or a funder or policymaker, is expecting to see a p-value that we're making a significant difference. We've now talked about the pros and cons of that, but if we collect data that forces people into very small groups, even though they may be experiencing tremendous positive change because of our initiative, that change will not be registering through a lot of statistical methods. There are pros and cons for how to collect demographic data. I would highly recommend, because I have to wrap this up now, unfortunately, but I would highly recommend putting that question into the forum. There are lots of people on the forum that are working on this exact question. It's probably our most common of threads, is like, how am I going to craft these demographic questions and how am I going to analyze them? And I have absolutely heard the request for a talking data equity on Bayesian analysis, on sampling, and on weighting, and we will do those. I will commit to you now. We will do those because this has been really, really great. I always get a little bit worried because I'm a mathematical statistician. So I get a little worried that if I do too many talking data equities that are very technical, it might get really boring. So since there's so much requests, I guess it's not really, really boring to everyone. Okay, good. Because I don't want to, just drone on and on about math. Okay, so we're going to leave it here today because I am trying very hard to wrap these up at 12:55 so that you all at least have 5 minutes between your next Zoom event. We do these most Fridays. The Zoom link stays the same. But if you want to make sure that you are on the mailing list for all of the things that ever happen at Talking Data Equity, which happens most Fridays, but not every Friday, make sure that you sign up in that registration form. And then we'll always make sure that you have the calendar invites and the topics. And if something special comes up, we'll make sure that you get on the list. So thank you for coming. I know Fridays in August. Oh, who wants to talk about technical p-values on Fridays in August? Well, I do, and it looks like you do too. So thank you for coming. I know that we didn't get to even like half the questions in the chat. Feel free to hop over to the forum and put them there. I'll be spending some time this weekend on the forum, so I'll make sure to answer your questions. All right. Talk to you later. Have a good Friday.